Jeremy did not know the true meaning of heartache until he heard the words from the Potato Lord that Isaiah was to be banished for killing a potato crop. He instinctively looked to see if the others had heard it. They wore the same expression. "Tell me I imagined it," he pleaded. "Tell me it isn't true." Dan licked his dry lips nervously and found that he couldn't even look Jeremy in the eyes. Garden had only silent sympathy. "But he's so careful! He wouldn't make such a big mistake." "Maybe," Dan mumbled, "it wasn't a mistake." Before Jeremy even knew what he was doing, he had wound his arm back and moved to punch Dan square in the face, but Garden managed to catch the attack. "Jeremy!" he barked. "Calm down!" Jeremy was shocked with himself and quietly retreated. "Let's just go to the church first." Jeremy nodded. They quickly made the trek back into town and over to the garden in front of the church. The gate had been left open, the piles of carrots were there, and Isaiah's bucket had been knocked over. Next to the bucket was an oddly placed stone, and the soil all around and leading to the gate was discoloured. Dan crouched down to investigate the darkened dirt. He touched it and inspected his fingers. "It's blood," he said. Jeremy bit his lip and slowly moved over to the stone. He dropped to his knees beside it and just stared for a moment before he dared to move it and find the small, dead plant. His heart leapt into his throat and his eyes stung. This couldn't be true. He didn't want to believe it. Garden would normally have been more logical about this, but this tragedy struck at the wrong time. He was already furious, and now his rage had a target. He stormed off by himself. "Where are you going?" Jeremy called in concern. "To find Isaiah." "Garden!" "Jeremy, I can't refuse the Potato Lord." Jeremy was taken aback, and even Dan flinched. They weren't used to this side of Garden. "Not now. I can't afford to." "We can't let ourselves compromise," Dan agreed reluctantly. "Jeremy, I think it's safe to say that we've already lost Isaiah." He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to think about it. He didn't want to lose his brother. However, the others were right. They had made a commitment, and they couldn't waver in their decision. "We'll have everyone search for him." The announcement was made. Isaiah was wanted. He was to be found and driven out of town. There didn't seem to be any trace of him, though. It was as if he had left of his own accord. He hadn't, of course. He hid in his own cellar for 2 days, tending to his wound. It had started as only a slight scratch, but it started bleeding when he tried to conceal his sin. Once he was in the damp basement, the blood poured from his injury so much that he thought he would die. It didn't seem possible for so much blood to seep out so quickly. The puddles on the floor around him had turned crimson, and all of the colour drained from his face. It did eventually stop, but Isaiah was so weak that he couldn't even stand. For 2 days he sat in the corner behind old boxes without food or untainted water. He knew that everyone would be hunting for him. There was no way a town of people who had become so loyal to the Potato Lord would ignore his crime. He was so terrified that he wouldn't have been able to move if he did regain his strength. "I can save you," the Carrot Goddess whispered. "Let me save you. I want to save you." Isaiah squeezed his eyes shut and tried to block her out. He didn't know what to do, so he didn't do anything. The sound of footsteps filtered through his weary senses as someone came down the stairs. Isaiah covered his mouth to hide his own heavy breathing as Jeremy entered the cellar. He had looked down there for Isaiah briefly when he first disappeared, but he was running out of places to look and was starting to go over them again. "Isaiah," he called quietly. Isaiah's heart raced. "Please come out. Where are you?" "They'll kill you," came the voice of the Carrot Goddess. "You don't need to die here, Isaiah." "Isaiah, just show yourself and tell me it's not true." "I can protect you. I'm the only one who can protect you." "Isaiah, we're brothers." It was all too much. Isaiah's head was spinning with the voices. He wanted nothing more than to end it all, but he couldn't bring himself to face his fate. There was another set of footsteps. "He's here," said Dan. Isaiah held his breath. "How can you tell?" Jeremy asked. Dan simply pointed to a smear of blood on the stone floor. They both carefully approached. As they did, they found another speck of blood. They followed the thin trail to where Isaiah was sitting in the filth, panting erratically with tears burning in his eyes. Jeremy's heart sank. "Why did you do it?" he questioned painfully. Isaiah couldn't even bring himself to speak. "Isaiah, why did you let this happen? Now you have to leave!" Isaiah didn't want to leave. He had nowhere else to go. What would he do? Even if he were permitted to live, he would just die out in the middle of nowhere. "I shall save you," said the goddess. "All you have to do is ask." "No!" Isaiah cried like a madman. "No, no, no!" Dan drew his sword. Jeremy instinctively tried to stop him, but he wasn't quick enough. The blade was poised beneath Isaiah's chin, ready to strike his throat if he made any sudden movements. Isaiah was perfectly still. He couldn't stand to look at the fierce face looming over him and closed his eyes, muttering quiet pleas. "You have to leave now," said Dan, cold and emotionless. "Dan, what are you doing? There's no room for hesitation, Jeremy. We know what has to happen to traitors." Isaiah managed to kick the boxes to his left, knocking them over and blocking the space between him and his attacker. With newfound adrenaline, he jumped to his feet and was off like a rocket. Unfortunately, his body caught up with him. The pain in his leg was too much for him to handle, and he fell back to the ground, landing face first in a puddle. He howled in pain as his leg began to bleed again. It burned like a branding iron as his blood seeped away at an unnatural speed. While his target was writhing on the floor, Dan slowly ambled over and held out his weapon again. "Dan, don't kill him!" Jeremy protested. "Look at him!" Dan flared. "He's on the brink of death already! Do you want me to leave him like this?" Jeremy was a broken man. It was evident that Dan shouldn't have asked such a question. How could anyone give an answer under those circumstances? Isaiah looked like a wounded deer, harmless and without a hope. "Jeremy," he choked. "Jeremy, help me!" Jeremy didn't respond. He felt like he wasn't even there, like he was just a bodiless spectator. Dan braced himself and raised his sword. Isaiah's eyes grew wide, and the next second seemed to last an eternity. In a moment of sheer terror, he cried out, "Save me, goddess!" The sword came down and clashed against the stone floor. Isaiah had vanished. There was complete silence. Dan just held his position as if he were waiting for the boy's return. Jeremy fell to his knees and covered his face. He didn't know where he had gone, but he was sure that he would never see his brother again. When Isaiah woke, he found himself in a strange bed in an unknown cavern. He looked down and noticed that his leg had been bandaged. He had been saved! How long had he been unconscious? Where was he now? He sat up abruptly and looked around to assess the situation for danger, but he appeared to be alone and safe. He stayed where he was for a while longer to meditate on all that had happened. He had lost everything. He was an outcast. How was he still alive, though? Had the carrot goddess really rescued him? He managed to stand and set about exploring his surroundings. It was as if someone had tried to make the cavern look more homely, but didn't know what a home looked like. There were various odds and ends that didn't seem to make sense. There was a stove, but it was just pushed up against the wall with no power supply. There was a low coffee table with dining chairs around it, none of which matched. It just felt like something from a strange dream that one would have after eating just before going to bed. Isaiah ran his fingertips along the top of the stove. If it had ever been used before, it hadn't been used recently. It was covered with dust. As he turned around, there was someone else standing behind him. She was a young woman with long golden hair and grey eyes that didn't seem to look at anything in particular. Isaiah immediately jumped back, but the girl didn't move. She pulled something out from behind her back and presented it to Isaiah. It was a carrot.